All right, I think we'll get started here, and if anyone else streams in, we can go a little later. Do you want to start off real quick?
Hey everybody, you've probably heard this 1,000 times already. Get a couple pre-announcements. I'm kind of just facilitating. If you have any questions about logistics or what's going on, just ask me. Couple things, this is recorded, so remember anything you say, questions, etc. are being recorded. Introduce yourself. If you have a question, just say who you are, where you're from, what you love working on, etc. Just so the room kind of can get acquainted with you. And then we're gonna reserve some time at the end for everyone. Like last call for people who want to speak. So if you have any ideas and you just don't get a chance to get them in, we'll have a few minutes at the end to do that. And that is all I have. And Jeff is going to kind of help moderate and get the session going. So thank you for coming, guys.
All right, yes, thank you for the introduction. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jeff Grafton. The GitHub username is Ixty, and I've sort of been one of the main people that's been working on the build and some extent the release infrastructure for Kubernetes, the main project, as well as doing some stuff in like repo infra and test infra and the release repo and some other things like that. And so I guess I propose this just because I know it's largely the build system kind of works, but it's not super well maintained, and I know there's issues. Like I know one thing that some people complain about is the building of some of the release artifacts like the RPMs and debs, which are currently in a separate repository, and just kind of some unclarity or lack of clarity around what are we going to do with Bazel, what other things like that. So this is kind of, I don't really have a particular topic. I don't know if people have things they're curious about, they want to talk about, they want to ask about. I can answer questions, we can discuss things, we can try to figure out what we want to try to do 2019. So I guess kind of anybody have anything they want to say or ask to start off with, or I can kind of talk about some of the problems and some of the things I think maybe might be worth tackling. Sure, here, there's a microphone, so if it's even on, and there you go. That way we can get that recorded.
This will be short. I was just going to say, could you give a quick overview of just the build process as it exists today? Just the
Sure.
stages and tooling that play a part in it?
Yes, this is where if I was more prepared, I would actually even put something up on a slide. I have some slides somewhere that talked about this, but I'll just kind of give a brief overview. So looking at Kubernetes, the main project, it's pretty much all a bunch of Go, and sort of the legacy or the original build system, which is still what we use for official releases, is basically a series of bash scripts with some make files and Docker files. And so basically the basic idea is that everything is driven by a make file, and then so for the releases, so we can actually get hermetic builds, we end up creating a build container. So it runs in Docker. We sync all of the source into that. We actually then eventually, through some shell scripts, end up running go build a bunch. We copy everything out of the Docker container. And then after that, then we use that to build Docker images. And then we tar everything all up into tar files. And so we can upload the tar files to GCS. And we can push the Docker images up to GCR. And then there's a separate out-of-band process, which then builds the debs and RPMs, and partially that works inside Google, but that's kind of something we want to improve, is kind of pull out some of the internal bits of that. And then there's like tooling, Monago, which is now driven by some cloud build script, which kind of does a lot of work around branching along with then calling into the make build system. So that's kind of one aspect. That's kind of how we do releases. If you're just developing locally, you can just use make directly, which skips the Docker step potentially. But we'll just use go build, go install, go test, whatever. And then there's Bazel, which is kind of a parallel effort we've been working on, which we were looking at possibly as a more maintainable way, or a differently maintainable way of kind of trying to duplicate a lot of this stuff and not have to maintain shell scripts and make files and Docker containers and all these things, trying to simplify on one system that maybe could be shared by different repositories. That's kind of, I don't know if that answers your question, or if there's follow-ups people want to ask about. I can go into more details about any of that.
So Jeff, our long-standing issue. How much you are optimistic what during next year with building and publishing RPMs will become not a tribal knowledge of Google's, but something automated, something what we can, get the documentation and modify.
Right. Yeah. So I think this is one of the things that I think, as they were talking about in the cluster lifecycle talk earlier today, I think there's some desire to try to improve the infrastructure around that. So like one issue particularly right now that's a problem is that all of the specs for the RPMs and debs lives in the Kubernetes release repository, and nothing's versioned there. And so as we have 3 different versions of Kubernetes we're building at the same time, sometimes the dependencies change and we aren't really tracking that version in the specs themselves. And a lot of the specs are falling out of date. It's actually doubly complicated because as part of the Bazel experiment, we actually moved some of these specs into the Kubernetes tree. And so now we have specs that are in both places that are out of sync. The official RPMs or the official RPMs and debs use the ones in Kubernetes release, whereas all of our CI is using the stuff that's in Kubernetes. It's not a good place. So I think one of the plans that I don't know if we actually have volunteers yet, but I think at least as like an initial thing is trying to get everything into Kubernetes. Kubernetes is like the source of truth for the specs for those artifacts. But then how exactly those are built is still kind of an open question. There's been some discussion of maybe using, NFPM, which is like a way of basically specifying everything in one YAML file that'll generate it. There's, Bazel was one thought, but we still have some things we're lacking in Bazel.
Well, putting specs and RPM, and Debian metadata into main repository is one side of the story.
Right.
But if we actually really want to support the RPM and Debian distributions, we need to have like specs for SUSE, specs for Red Hat, deb information for Ubuntu deb, for Debian, the pristine ones, and so on. But that's one side of the story. Like the second part of the story, like how we actually able to publish it, and publish it in a way what like we can have like different distributions, because right now like we only have for CentOS RPMs, which is more or less luckily works under OpenSUSE, but not always. Similar, like we have like bunch of different versions of Ubuntu, which might require different tricks, and when we have a problem of like multiplying it by branching of Kubernetes itself, like 112, 113, 114, and so on.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're getting at a real problem with this, or one of the real problems with this right now is that we created these debs and RPMs, but I don't know. Yeah, there's all these different distributions and things, and like I think right now, currently we target like not the latest Ubuntu. So people have complained that I think like we don't have Bionic debs, and like I don't even know what we're doing. Like you probably know more about the RPMs than I do. So it's kind of
we need different hacks for building.
Right. Yeah. So different hacks is what you were saying. So pretty much, yeah. It's one of these things where I think we need somebody to kind of step forward and own this, and I don't exactly know. Maybe that's the cluster lifecycle team is the right group to kind of do that, or maybe it's a shared thing between cluster lifecycle and the release team. But at some point, it's like, is it the Kubernetes project maintaining this? Should it be more like an OS distribution that's actually maintaining these things? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think we need to look into this and kind of try to figure that out. And I think that's something that's lacking is that, it's easy if you're just building, just pushing up the binaries and Docker images and whatever. But when we're starting to get all the distributions and dependencies and things like that, it starts to get really tricky. And as to the notion of where to host it, I think that's something that there's, I don't know if people here are familiar with, there's this, there's like an infra working team or working group, which is basically trying to get all of the Kubernetes open source project infrastructure off of a Google-owned project onto CNCF-owned projects. And so this is one of the things somewhere down the list is like, yeah, we need somewhere to host debs and RPMs. And I don't know if the plan is just to like throw them up in GCS or to like actually host something. I think that's kind of another open question looking for somebody who has interest in this to make it work. I think a lot of, what's going on here is there are a lot of problems, and it's just, they're kind of things that anyone who's interested is welcome to kind of step forward and propose something and work on something, because I think it's just a lot of these that are best effort support, and unfortunately people are relying on all these things that don't have the best support. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
How common is it for projects to publish RPMs themselves versus like the distribution publishing packages? I would wonder if maybe we might not actually want the project to run all of this. And I would add that for the most part, the packages just contain the binaries. The only thing that gets kind of interesting between releases is the systemd unit files, I believe. There isn't really anything else in the package. We don't have man pages or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know if you want to answer that or you have thoughts.
Yeah, well, at least I can share some of history about what. I think it was discussed at, like, last spring in Berlin, in KubeCon Berlin. So on one hand, yes, we want distributions to package Kubernetes. The problem is what most of those distributions, we have very long release cycles. So, like, imagine the CentOS will package the Kubernetes. Right now, it will be like version 1.8, or maybe even earlier. Second thing, we want to be for people to be able to use the latest and greatest version of. So it means, like, for us as a cluster lifecycle, we need to provide a way to install it and install it in an easy way. Like, definitely, we are not the best people to maintain those packages, but we are trying to balance somehow between the usability and functionality.
Actually, I have a thought there that someone else in cluster lifecycle I think initially mentioned, and then it kind of fell off. I would wonder how viable you think this is. Potentially, what we could do is have Kubeatum or Kubelet ship with their files baked in with something like Go bin data and just write them. And then what you need, like Kubelet, Kubeatum, maybe kubectl binaries, you can ship those however you want, and the rest is Docker images. It might not be the best idea, but
Yeah, it's exactly the thing what I was trying to propose, like in Berlin in last year, but it was greatly opposed by the rest of the team, saying like, no, the kubeadm should not be taking care of those files. So it should be the system package management to actually handle those components.
do we know why they think the Kubeatum can? Or if that's
It was just discussion of the scope, like what could kubeadm should be responsible for. So the kubeadm responsible for bootstrapping the cluster itself, like to write all we needed metadata, maybe to pull the needed images, but not not modifying the OS.
when was this discussion?
Spring last year, spring 17.
I think since then, Kubeatum started writing one of the unit files itself and to drop it.
No, we have one which comes from package, and the rest is just environment file, which is included in the unit file.
Right.
But again, it's just environment file. It's not the full management of components.
If you still personally think that's a good idea, I would use it.
Well, personally, when I'm talking about the way what actually do you need to run the kubeadm and think, what I'm always saying is, like, if you use CentOS or Ubuntu, you can use the packages what we provide. But if you are using anything else or any of unsupported distributions, just follow the instruction what was created for CoreOS. CoreOS exactly specifies like what, like 3 or 4 binaries you need to put on your system, where you need to put the systemd init file with all needed parameters for kubeadm, and that's it. And then you can reuse that workflow with all your needed tools like Ansible, Puppet, whatever you use in your environment. But then it means like the package management not involved at all. But, well, not all people appreciate that approach.
Anyone else have thoughts or comments? Yeah, I mean, I think that's one kind of open question I still have, and I don't think there's really an answer for that, is what artifacts should the Kubernetes project itself be building and releasing? Is what are the different repositories responsible for? What are we actually trying to ship? We kind of have a variety of things, and what is actually most useful to end users? What's useful for the project, and we kind of have certain things that seem to work, but maybe I don't know if it's ideal right now, and maybe we need to revisit that or figure out what actually is useful. I guess that's another thought, but.
I would also point out I don't think we have any CI.
Yeah, use the microphone.
I don't think we actually have CI using anything but the Debian packages, and we have pretty limited CI for that. For the continuous stuff, there's some continuous integration that uses the Debian packages for Kubernetes Anywhere, but there's not much else using the packages. So if we expand the number of distributions that we're shipping things for, I'd be a little bit concerned about saying, hey, we ship these artifacts, but also no one has stepped up to make sure they work. So I think Jeff already mentioned this, but there's a Kate's infra work group, and I think we need interested parties to step up there, because the people like Jeff that are maintaining things now have too much to maintain, and adding a couple more distros to their plate is probably not going to help.
Well, and I'd also point out, like, the infrastructure working group is definitely the right place to be talking about things like where we host the Debians, or the Debs and the RPMs, and how we go about promoting them. But the SIG release is also the key owner of what artifacts do we actually ship, and if we're going to ship an artifact, how do we test it, and how do we make sure that that is the same kind of high quality releases that you get from either looking at the binary or the source code or that kind of stuff. If you're going to get a Deb or an RPM, is that going to be will that have undergone the same kind of testing and stuff as the other release artifacts that we distribute have?
So an interesting side note on the which artifacts do we control and which we don't. So in the case of core DNS, which went from basically self-maintained to CNCF project. So it's in the verge of doing something and switching which artifacts actually get delivered with Kubernetes. So that's still an open question even for stuff that is currently shipping. So the containers get built by the project, but the API or the pull that is actually done and the API that is used is actually controlled by Kubernetes. So it's still, even for something that is currently shipping, it's an open question. So if you have ideas, please come forward in general. Because it will get harder and harder with a lot more plugins coming in, everything being decoupled into more container-based things. So it's not completely release-based, but I thought it's a...
Well, it actually reminded me another question. Last month it was the KubeCon China, and most people don't know how a Chinese firewall behaves. So the scenario with the current release infrastructure for Kubernetes is such what our download site, the S3, is it's accessible from the China. So you can get the information what is the latest release, you can fetch the binaries. But none of our images are possible to fetch from China because Google registry is banned. So going further, do we have any plans to have infrastructure available across the world?
So there is some proposal, which is really early stages, which comes into the notion of the Kubernetes project controlling the endpoints, but not controlling the actual infrastructure behind it. So that it doesn't matter if the images are hosted by Azure, Google, or AWS, or whatever. But the entry point is always Kubernetes.io or something, so that the switch is seamless. And with that change, it would be easy to get a company in China who knows the providers, who knows the infrastructure, to actually be one of the backends to that. So it would just be on a DNS side, maybe, to do the switch like a GeoDNS type thing. So there is something, but it's not ready yet type thing. There is a workaround if you want to do something like that. So one of our open source projects is basically a redirect engine, which also supports basically mapping the whole of GCR into your own domain, and adds a cache to that. So that works. And the other one is hosting a local registry, Docker registry. But that's knowledge, locally.
Yeah, most of Chinese people actually doing that, but still it was a bit of surprise. What, like part of infrastructure available, part is not.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments, questions? I guess I'll pose one. Who is happy with the Kubernetes build system? Who's happy day-to-day building and testing Kubernetes? Or who's not happy? All right, why are you not happy?
Because it takes forever.
You want to expand?
If I miss one thing, or worse yet, if I have to rebase changes, I'm looking at an hour and a half of just waiting for those changes, which didn't produce any measurable change. I have to wait an hour and a half. And sometimes that hour and a half feels very stressful because the code freeze is in an hour and 45 minutes. And so I have to be very careful.
I think Ben raised his hand.
With that hour and a half, we were talking about the precipits.
Yes.
Great. We have plans to kill that.
I know you do. I'm excited about it.
It's like the first round of tests, and then it's the merge test, and then it's the actual merge test.
I'm not even very terrified about an hour and a half back.
So I feel like at various points in time, the idea had been floated about making the KK repo primarily just like an integration repo of, Kubernetes foo and Kubernetes bar, then both get vendored into Kubernetes, and we don't actually do any development in KK.
Right.
Is that still, obviously that is not really, maybe that's more the case today than it was a couple years ago, but I don't think that vision has fully been realized. Like, what do you and or other people here think about that vision? Is it, or, what's the state of things related to that?
Yeah, I haven't heard a whole lot about it until like today, actually, at the SIG architecture talk, where they talked about the code organization sub-project. It's like, oh, that's neat. That sounds cool. So I think it sounds like it's something that the organization is interested in, but I think it sounds like also it's something that still needs people to step up and actually work on it. I think it's, if you go back to last year, I think it was Tim Hawken and Michael Rubin had the talk about, like, is Kubernetes an operating system? What is Kubernetes the project? Is it more of an operating system? Is it a project? Are the core Kubernetes binaries? I'm probably going to do a horrible job of actually describing this, but I think the basic gist was that, like, the core Kubernetes binaries are kind of like the Linux kernel, and then, like, all the stuff that actually makes Kubernetes work is kind of like, the Linux distribution you usually use. And currently, Kubernetes is trying to kind of be both. And it's maybe not doing the best job at being both, and so maybe we need to actually figure out how to treat them as separate projects. And then that asks different questions about what do we build and how do we build and how do we release and test everything together in a meaningful way. And so I don't know if anyone has answers about that. I mean, I think it's an interesting thought experiment, at least, and I think should be probably explored some more. But it does raise a lot of questions about how do we actually synchronize release cadences and test everything together, because now, if you're actually developing as a bunch of different, not mono repos, but like just mini repos, maybe not super mini, but smaller repos, then you need to still somehow have a way to be able to make a change that affects a bunch of different things together, be able to get those PRs in, and be able to test these things in CI, constantly integrating. And so, how does that work? Is that something that the test infrastructure can help with, or the build infrastructure? So I think there's a lot of open questions about this, and I think that's why largely the project has sort of still stayed a mono repo. and not tried to really, I mean, some pieces have moved out, but I think a lot of the core stuff is still in the main repository because it's challenging and nobody's really kind of tackled that yet.
I think we'll likely use staging source as the mini mono repo for a while, like kube control. As they're trying to do things, they're bringing things into staging source, and there was some discussion about kubelet going to staging source, and just treating it as a little bit less of the monolithic code base, but more of the integration point. So it's on that way, but like everything in Cube, I think it'll probably certainly seems like it's going to take a couple of years, and the code quality working group I think might be a good place to participate for that.
So now being all the architectures like ARM and PPC are like multi-arch images, right? So do we have any plan of including any of these non-AMD architectures for the PR testing and all?
Right. I mean, I think we'd gladly do that. The main thing is we just need actual machines to test it on. And I guess there's kind of, that gets into the question of like, is that something Kind could help with? I don't know. Like, I don't know at what level we're testing, and maybe that's an EDB test. So we're kind of trying to move. I mean, it seems like a lot of the desire is that we're not using these sort of large, multi-machine EDB tests on PRs because they're kind of slow and flaky. But I do think, we should get more testing on multi-arch, especially in CI. And I think it's mostly just been waiting on the relevant companies or CNCF to kind of supply the actual machines to be able to do that testing. But we are definitely building that, and I think we're interested in that. But yeah, I think it's mostly just been a lack of resources.
Okay, thanks.
So on top of that, one question I suddenly remembered is, so currently all the pre-submit testing we're using Bazel build. And I think I've talked with Windows people. They have some interest to add a Windows pre-submit, but they are asking if we are able to build a Windows version of the binary using Bazel. Seems like currently the Bazel arc is hard-coded.
Yes, that is a good question. I guess one thing, I'll just back up. The reason we're currently using Bazel for our PR testing is mostly for performance. We actually have a remote cache that runs on Prow called Greenhouse, which lets us basically cache a lot of the build and test output. So that way multiple PRs are mostly not changing much stuff, and most of the code is the same. That way we can actually just reuse those build artifacts, and that actually cuts down our test time from 20 minutes to 5 minutes, and build time similarly goes down a lot. So that helps a lot. But yeah, so the Bazel build kind of we have some challenges mostly around cross compilation of Seago is not really implemented right now. So we're mostly just targeting building for Linux AMD 64, which is kind of the main thing we've cared about. But then, yeah, so if we're trying to target something like Windows right now, they're hard-coded strings. We could probably, make those things more configurable, but I'm not sure if we'll be able to cross-build everything for Windows because of some of the Seago requirements we have in kubelet. Although I don't know if kubelet, how that works. I don't know enough about the Windows support, so I don't know how much of an issue that might be. And if you have anything to add, please.
We talked about this a little bit at BazelCon, actually. And the impression I got is that none of this stuff is technically impossible, but we lack a champion for it. So if somebody wants to step up and figure out how to glue all of this stuff together, I think most of the pieces are there already, but nobody's really motivated to replace the jiggery that we've got.
I think Matt has a comment.
So a couple of timely things there. We are trying. Windows is a bit of a different problem than architectures because it's completely different. It's not just the actual build, the functionality and the logic is different. So we're going to have a separate discussion around that. But as far as architectures go, that's exactly the kind of thing where we don't want to cram all of the things in pre-submit, but we're really looking to get people to do that in post-submit. We have a program now. There's a KEP through SIG Cloud Provider for getting cloud providers to upload conformance results to test grid as kind of a first step for getting signal. And we just this morning have a new one from ARM where they're using Amazon's new ARM machines to run conformance tests in that way. And we previously had some limited results from them. I don't think they have any good CI for this yet. I think they're actually just running it. But if someone wants to step up and like say, I have a bunch of power PCs, I'm going to like run the conformance tests from head, produce the results, the release team will probably be more than happy to start blocking on that after seeing like maybe a week or two of good signal. And I think that's probably the right way to get CI for those. I don't think it's very likely that we're going to somehow turn like say our GCP credits into ARM machines.
Any other thoughts or comments? Anyone have anything? Trying to think. So,
hey, are there any plans to wrap all the generator scripts in reusable Bazel rules? Like I spent 2 days recently trying to understand why it generates one thing on my laptop and it works fine, and it doesn't work on my CI machine.
okay. Yeah, so
It turned out its Go root was not set as an environment variable, because if you build things with Bazel, which I was building generators using Bazel, the Go root is set to some, literally to Go root string, and it wasn't able to discover standard library. It's just terrible. Anyway.
Yeah. I'd be curious, I could follow up in specific details about what you're trying to do. I know that's something that I've worked a little bit on with generating code, so kind of some background there. As you may or may not be familiar, there is a fair amount of generated code in Kubernetes, and most of it follows this kind of Kubernetes-specific code generator pattern. There's these frameworks in case.io/CodeGen. I can't remember what it is right now. I think there's one CodeGen, and there's a few different things. And so basically, these are things that, like, if you were at the API tooling talk, things like that generate conversion functions and defaulters and deep copy and OpenAPI, and there's a number of other ones. And basically, these are all configured. They're Go tools, and they look for sources that basically have what looks like a Go build tag, and that basically tells the generator it needs to generate something in that directory, that package. And then it basically uses some of the Go build AST information to then generate stuff. And so this is kind of a little bit opposed to how Bazel likes to, Bazel basically you have to kind of declare in build files all your inputs, and this kind of just operates across the entire tree. So we've kind of been trying to figure out how to make that work well. But then also, you run into other things where a lot of these tools expect to run in a valid Go path with a valid Go root. And so we've written some custom Bazel rules to do that. So the OpenAPI code generator is actually working in Bazel, and there's some oncoming support to support other code generators. But it's kind of a very case-to-case basis. It's not really, we haven't invested time in making a, it would be great, again, if this was something that people were interested in, we could potentially write Bazel rules or custom rules that would live next to the code generator repository that you could import into your Kubernetes project. And rather than having to generate your all of your generated code, your client Go code, and your API machinery, and all this stuff, potentially there would just be a Bazel rule. You would run this on your repository, and then Bazel would build everything. You wouldn't have to check it in. And of course, the side effect of that is now somebody can't go get your repository, which is kind of an open question too of is this, which way do you want to go down? Which path do you want to go down? Do we want stuff to be Go gettable? There's a whole lot of other considerations there and ways we can attack that. That's kind of another down into the weeds. I don't know if we want to talk about that, but that's another kind of side effect of just how do we want to build things, and what is kind of the model we want to go forward. I think another kind of interesting question, which I would like to see, is right now I feel like we have 150 repositories in Kubernetes or something like that, and how do you actually build whatever the relevant artifact from that repository? In some cases, it's a make file. In some cases, it's read the README and see what it says. I think a lot of them are go build or something, and maybe there's a make file, but it's a different make target. Some of them are hermetic, some of them are not. So there's a very, very non-standard way of building things, and it might be interesting to have a more standard way of building stuff, but also coming to that consensus might be difficult with this many repositories. So I don't know. I don't know if it's anything people are interested in. I think there's a lot of interesting problems here, and I think we can make a lot of improvements at getting reproducible builds and hermetic builds, and just making things predictable such that if you're contributing to one Kubernetes project, you should be able to go to another Kubernetes project and know how to run the tests, know how to build things, and have that expectation. And right now, we're not there for sure. So.
Cool. I just want to mention that we have 10 minutes remaining, and then we have a break. So we have 10 minutes left, so make sure to get your questions in.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts people have following up from that?
I mentioned there's a break, so they just want to leave now.
Yeah. I mean, I see a lot of people here, and a lot of people haven't asked questions. So I want to know why people came here. Why do people care about build and release infrastructure, and who wants to do something about it? Who wants to fix things? And what should we tackle? What's important?
We should get rid of all the make files and shell scripts. Bazel.
How many people in this room knows how to write Bazel?
How many
How many people in here know how Bazel works? Right.
What's a reliable shell script?
Exactly.
So I mean, I guess, another show of hands, who here generally uses just make build or go build or go test, just directly calls make or go or whatever? Who uses Bazel? All right, there's actually, that's interesting. There's a lot more Bazel. Well, I guess we're pretty heavily weighted on my team, but there was a lot more Bazel people here than I expected. But yeah, and are people here mostly in the main Kubernetes repository, or what other repositories are people building in? Just curious.
I embarked on a project relatively recently to switch cluster lifecycle provider or cluster API provider AWS completely over to Bazel. So that includes things like generating YAML manifests and generating container images and all of that stuff.
Okay. Anyone else using a non-Kubernetes repository or non-main Kubernetes repo?
So I don't work on Kubernetes itself. Yes, I send PRs from time to time, but for our internal stuff at Atlassian, for our project, we use Bazel, and I recently did a lot of work to switch a bunch of build, code that builds the code to Bazel from Shell, Python, Make, and all this recursive stuff that one thing calling nothing, and it's pretty nice actually. I think I'm really happy with the result, but the current issue is the code generation or the client generation, set generation, defaulting, and so on. Would be really nice to replace that, but I don't think I can do it myself without modifying the way that generated code is generated. So you don't know what the outputs will be, and it's not compatible with how Bazel expects things to be. So I need Kubernetes to change so that I can do something about it.
Yeah. I know I have some thoughts about this. I haven't turned it into a doc, but I think I have some ideas of how we could better support the Kubernetes generated code inside in Bazel. I kind of de-emphasized this for a bit because there was uncertainty about whether we wanted to actually remove this stuff from checking it in, but I can certainly follow up, and maybe then somebody can come along and try to implement it. It might be a good first step.
Yeah, I would say looking like Jeff recently updated how we do the open API generated code, and that has a fairly good Bazel rule for it. So maybe looking at that would be a good place to start before Jeff's doc exists. And then for writing Bazel rules, it's definitely, it's actually fairly, it's like a variant of Python, more or less. So it's not actually that bad. It's sort of, it's obviously not exactly the same as Python. It's kind of like a subset of Python. And you definitely, lose some hairs trying to figure things out initially. But once you figure out the rules and the macros and all that, it's fairly okay.
Did you have a comment back there real quick?
I do maintain some parts of the cloud provider GCP repo, and it's like a set of fairly trivial Go binaries, and it's using Bazel now for everything and building images and everything. But I really wish it didn't. Like for that use case, Bazel is overkill. It would be fine with just Go build and like a shell script. Right. So to your point of having like a unified build system, it might be just too much work to set it up for some simpler repos.
I completely forgot what I was going to say. Oh, I was going to say that I've found for certain projects, Bazel lets you basically define functions that are a set of outputs for a given thing, and I've found that to be very helpful over a makefile, because you can very easily say, I want these 3 binaries to each have a binary, a tarball, and a container, all generated by them, and it's a bit easier to manage, I think, than having a bunch of different makefile dependencies for all those things and like sourcing shell scripts and stuff. It's a little harder to trace what's going on.
Are we okay with potentially? I don't know if we want to talk more about Bazel, but throwing potentially another monkey into the system. Mm-hmm. I feel like a large part of our build complexity is trying to support Mac's terrible versions of everything, right? Which is the primary reason why we build in a container and whatnot. And like, have we considered like dropping support for Mac builds? What would building on Mac? Well, what do people think about that idea?
Yeah, how many people here build Kubernetes on a Mac? That's a pretty good percentage.
So has anyone gotten any tests working on Mac? Like you can build it, but can you test it at all? You can?
Bazel test, whatever, should work pretty well for, at least unit tests should work fairly well. And yeah, I don't know. I've done that.
Except for the stupid stuff that got done in staging, it sets the Go import. But
Can you get microphone?
It's interesting because like the Bazel test stuff works. It's the friction, but like I haven't really hit stuff. It's just people forget that people occasionally run Go test on Macs or whatever, and that's usually when I do go look when those get hit, there'll usually be a PR open for it. So it is kind of there's enough people that there's some pressure, but it's not a huge pressure, and it certainly happens frequently that people forget.
Yeah, so like a lot of the issues that I had were just sort of like, slight mismatches between, what, the new make on, Apple versus, everywhere else on the planet, or, some library doesn't exist, or, some test assumes that it's being run in Bazel with like, the workspace being switched and stuff like that. It just seems like, I don't know, is it worth, trying to spend resources allowing it to be built in Mac if it seems like being able to do a full development cycle in it is not that well supported?
Like when you say well supported, like I have 1,200 commits in the Kubernetes repo that says it's possible, but it's painful. And like Bazel does have a lot of improvements. Like a lot of the things we've done to improve Mac support or improve the Mac support actually hurt me because I don't run Docker for Mac, for instance. So it's like some of this is like maybe we don't do a great job of polling the community who is on Mac, like what they actually need. The reproducibility of Bazel, I haven't had any problems with Bazel on Mac since they finally fixed, since the sandbox stuff started working again. So it's more, I think Bazel's better than it ever has been, and the rest of the support has atrophied a little bit.
So to be fair, this was this was probably over a year ago too, so I may just be like a noisy, out-of-date data point. So, yeah.
One sort of minor thing that Christoph did over in the test info repo was essentially, there was something where I think it was basically we just depended on a version of SED, and obviously that did not work on the standard Mac thing, so we just did a check to make sure that GSED was installed, and then if it wasn't, give people an instruction for how to install that on their Mac, and that has been helpful. Obviously, it's not perfect, and I'm sure there's other things it'll run in, but that's been, I'd recommend that for your repo.
Yes. only when running Bash.
I had we were having trouble with envsubst because envsubst is a command line utility that sometimes exists on Linux and sometimes doesn't. And I had very good success with, I found somebody made a Go version of it. I added that as a Go dependency to Bazel, and now Bazel builds that, and we don't have to worry about what version is on somebody's machine because we build our own version. We know it's compatible because we just built it. It only has to be built once because Bazel will cache it. And I think that made that particular bit of code all the more portable than it would have been otherwise if we were like, checking to see if certain versions existed.
Couple more minutes, I think.
Yeah. So we're coming up towards the end. I don't know if people have more questions or comments.
I actually wanted to continue up. It's like I think the Bazel support now is in a much better state, and I would be the first person to say unwinding Tim's abomination of make and shell would be the crowning achievement of this project. One of the challenges is on the taking the checked code out. We've fixed a lot of the previous conflict rebase issues. There's a lot better now than it was in the past. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting because today Go build does mostly work. Go test does work. As Go build has gotten better, a lot of the advantages that Bazel had over the run, I don't notice as much anymore because I do have a warmed up Go cache. So it is interesting how as Bazel has gotten better, Go has also gotten a little bit better. Some of the aspects of having everything checked in are nice because we do just play well with vendoring and other tools so we don't cause friction. So there is kind of a nice balance. If we kind of stray too far from that, we should probably commit to it rather than staying moving out of that comfort zone, but then not having a middle ground. So that'd be a good topic to explore, I think.
Yeah. And I think one thing from supporting Go, I think, we discussed if we want to actually switch to Bazel as the official way of doing things, and we wanted to remove generated code. One thought was there's probably ways, maybe with Go modules or other things, there might be ways we could export we could build all of the generated code and then export it to a Git repository, kind of like we do with the staging. So we would the master Kubernetes repository would not have anything checked in, but we would still have something we would export that people could go get. And so stuff that's in staging is a great example, but we discovered that people also apparently depend on, or they vendor kates.io/Kubernetes, which was not expected, maybe immediately expected. I discovered this when I removed some generated code that broke stuff. So that's kind of, I think, still something to be discussed. I think one other comment I just want to make on the merge conflicts used to be a really big deal on build files. And I think, both of those have improved, I think, which is great to hear. But also there's some experimental support. Liz can actually probably talk about this a little bit as well. There's this tool called AutoGazelle, which will actually automatically generate these build files, and you won't have to check in most of the stuff. It would just automatically, when you run Bazel, figure out all the stuff that's already in your Go files. We haven't experimented with it in Kubernetes yet. I know Liz has been doing some work with that.
I'm going to do FIFO on this. The original point when I raised my hand is that I don't think Bazel provides much advantage for just where you would otherwise be running Go build. Go build is a perfectly fast tool. It has caching and all of that sort of stuff, but we do a lot of weird stuff on top of that. We're generating YAML, we're generating code, we're generating all of this stuff. And all of that stuff already doesn't work super well with Go build. We just put it in the right place where it's expected. And I think it's those, once you stray a little bit off the beaten path of what Go build sort of natively does, that's where Bazel really shines. Because you don't have to worry about making sure that your environment is exactly right. And on the AutoGazelle front, I tried to use it for a personal project I was building, and I did run into some trouble. Filed a bunch of issues. The maintainer of RulesGo, Jake Conrad, is very responsive and very friendly. So he is working on them. I think it's not ready for something like KK's yet. But I think it could be ready for, a smaller repository that, every once in a while you're going to have to blow away your cache and start from scratch, and that'll take a minute out of your day, not 2 hours out of your day.
So I guess we're kind of out of time. I don't know if we actually got proper action items out of this, but I would say the main thing, going forward is, file feedback on what you think works and what doesn't work. Always looking for people to work on stuff. There's plenty of things to do. I'm always around on Slack. You can find me on like Bazel channel or SIG release or SIG testing. Kind of we span all these various places. But if you have thoughts about this, you want to improve things, like please step forward, please help out. We're always short of people, as I think most of the Kubernetes project is. So let's take this discussion forward and continue and figure out, make things better.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.